So hi, I'm Gary Rosenfeld. As Mark said, I'm a partner in BD Labs, which is a business development consulting group. We work to a great extent in the interactive game space, representing IP owners and also publishers and licensees. We also work in consumer products and have done a lot of work, particularly lately, in the digital video space. So prior to forming BD Labs, I was at 20th Century Fox, overseeing all of the console and PC game licensing, so working on properties like The Simpsons, Family Guy, Avatar, Alien, et cetera, et cetera. So I've been on the outbound licensing side, and prior to that, I was at THQ, the now defunct video game publisher, where I ran business development and handled licensing on the inbound licensing side. So while I was there, brought in the Ultimate Fighting Championship and a couple other properties. We also had a huge library of licensed content, including Disney, Pixar, Nickelodeon, and a bunch of other stuff. So that's me, and that's my background, and I'll be moderating the panel, so I'm going to hand it to Mike to introduce himself.
All right. I'm Mike Blank. I'm head of mobile at Creative Artists Agency, one of the largest entertainment and sports agencies in the world. I've been there just over 7 years now, focused on partnership opportunities for our clients across different verticals, so actors, actresses, writers, directors, musicians, athletes, those sorts of people, and creating partnership opportunities for them with mobile developers and publishers. So everything from large-scale, completely new IP games, like Gordon Ramsay's game with Glue, or Demi Lovato, an episode in Pocket Gems, to sort of smaller event-driven cameo opportunities for clients, be it Avril Lavigne or Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Tiny Co. Family Guy game, or working with Covet Fashion to create Covet Hosts on a monthly recurring basis and things like that.
Hi, I'm Robert Zakari. I'm General Counsel for Jam City. Jam City is a mobile game publisher and developer. We acquired Tiny Co. a couple of years ago, so now we've got our biggest titles are Marvel, Avengers Academy. We just announced today our Harry Potter game that's coming out in, a little bit later this year. Also, we have our own IP games, Cookie Jam, Panda Pop. Those are match 3 puzzle type games. We are in a unique position as a publisher to not only have major licensed IP that we work with, but we also value our own IP, and we continue to develop and publish games that are based on IP that we create in-house. So we have a unique position in the marketplace to be able to evaluate both sides, and we've done both, and we can see the pros and cons.
I'm Daniel Engelhardt. I report to Peter Levin at Lionsgate, who came in about 3.5 years ago to start our games division. Our focus is making games based off of our IP as well as third-party IP that we partner with. But we've also invested in some really great game companies, including Telltale Games, Next Games, who makes AMC's Walking Dead mobile game. And then we're invested in an esports franchise called Immortals, which has the LA Valiant, one of 12 teams that are competing in the inaugural season of Overwatch League. So we're in a really fun spot in that we get to partner with really great developers to make games, but also get to be involved more strategically with some of our partners and get into the weeds of understanding what the realities are for their business, and similar to you guys, getting to see what it's like for them to be licensing IP, whether it's from us or other partners.
And I'm Sebastian. I'm responsible for business development at FoxNext. FoxNext Games is basically a completely new business unit for Fox, focusing on game development and game publishing. It's only a year old. We just announced that we acquired another studio, so we are very heavily involved in building up our internal development capacities. But at the same time, we have a very strong licensing team that has been working on with Jam City and Tiny Co on titles like Family Guy, Book of Life, and others. So very active in the outbound licensing side, while building up our internal capabilities as well.
Great. So the topic of our panel today is essentially we want to introduce you guys to what the entry points are for licensing, both inbound and outbound licensing. So just to kind of maybe take a step back and for those that might be new to this and some of the nomenclature we're going to use. So outbound licensing is essentially like Sebastian, who works at 20th Century Fox, and Daniel at Lionsgate. They own intellectual properties, and they're looking for outlets to commercialize those intellectual properties in the interactive game space. Inbound licensing is essentially game publishers who are looking for intellectual properties to either attach to existing games or develop new experiences based on those properties on their own. So that's outbound and inbound licensing. And so we're going to essentially go through the steps that one would consider on both sides of the fence. So I'm going to throw questions out to the panel, and it's going to kind of be free-formed here. I'll let you guys have at it. So the first question that is, I guess, fundamental starting point is what does a person that's interested in licensing need to consider before approaching a licensor to acquire a license, or if you have an IP, going out to attract a licensee for IP. So what would be the goals and objectives, the things you need to consider right up front? You know, creative, financial, marketing, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe we'll just throw it to Rob, who's with the game publisher. You know, what are you looking at?
So I think first and foremost, before we go out to get IP, is we have to make sure that we have a good game. I've said this over and over again for the last couple of years. If you don't have a good game or a good product or a good idea, no amount of great IP is going to create long-term value for you. So once you have the concept, or you have an idea, or you have the game, I think we look at a variety of factors, and it actually has changed over time. There used to be a school of thought that you get the IP that's going to jumpstart or to crank the motor in the form of initial buzz and user acquisition to launch the game and then kind of move it along. I think as we've progressed nowadays, we're looking for a much more long-term outlook. So it has to be an IP that is that can't just be a flash in the pan or a movie release that's coming out. Maybe something that has longevity. And then finally, something else that's really important as well is to make sure that the IP is global if your game is global. If you have a game that is specific to a territory, then you can maybe choose an IP that's very specific, but global appeal is probably the other big thing that we look at. Okay. So that's very broad, but kind of the first steps.
Okay, and then so Daniel and Sebastian, how about you? You guys own the IP, and you're looking to find the right partners. What are those initial considerations? Yeah, well, just to reiterate what Rob said, obviously a great game is critical. You can if you have a bad game connected to the biggest IP in the world, it's not going to succeed. So for us, our focus is finding world-class developers to partner with that are going to make great games that can monetize. Obviously, there's a marketing benefit to the IP for having a great game in the marketplace. It's an incredible amount of engagement. It certainly can increase the brand equity of the IP, but our focus is making sure that we trust the team, that they have a game that we all sort of collectively believe in, that they're super passionate about the IP. And in particular with a mobile game, it can live on for years, right? So we want to make sure that it's a team that we connect with that's really passionate about the IP and that we can be in the weeds together for a long time, and that interests are aligned in the deal that we put together to make sure that we're mutually incentivized to grow that game.
Okay. We actually have a very similar approach. I would say like team is probably like one of the most important factors for whenever we look into, like licensing one of our IPs, we would look into like, what did the team do before? What is their setup? What kind of games and successes did they have? And do they have the capabilities of like delivering a high quality game for our brands that, fans would interact with and engage with? So that is very important for us. But then also regional concerns, like Rob mentioned. So we do have some IPs that are very strong in specific regions, like if you look Kingsman movie. Kingsman has been very popular in the US, but Kingsman was extremely popular in Korea. So whenever we have, like Outliers was actually like the biggest non-Korean R-rated movie of all time in Korea, interestingly enough. But then we look into IPs like that and we are like, okay, maybe for that particular one, we need a developer who could cater more like the Korean audience. So then we would like maybe target it more specifically into specific regions if we know like, an IP is like stronger in Korea or Japan or whatsoever.
Right.
I think another thing too that is really important is making sure that the core mechanics of the game connect with the IP and that there's a genuine synergy there, which sounds obvious, I'm sort of stating the obvious, but like for example, our Power Rangers game is a real-time player versus player fighting game, and that was very contextual to the Power Rangers IP because it's always been about being a superhero with your friends. So Power Rangers fans got super excited about the notion of being able to play a Power Rangers game and fight against each other, right? If you look at like Pokemon Go, part of the reason that that's so successful is that game like lends itself to the Pokemon IP in a really genuine way. So when we're interacting with our like potential game partners, it's also evaluating the IP and making sure that the game that we're making is contextual to the audience that we're building it for, and that it ultimately is going to be a super fun experience for the right people.
Right. So Mike, you sit right in the middle of this whole thing. And I spent some time at Endeavor doing something similar, but in another video game era, where it was console games, PC games. Now you got mobile games and games as a service. So why don't you chime in and give us your take?
I was going to say, building sort of what Daniel was saying, for us it comes down to authenticity, right? The same sort of, like, it has to make sense on many levels, and there has to be a reason why you want to be working with a specific celebrity or athlete or have them in that type of game for that type of audience. Gordon Ramsay in a cooking game, again, seems obvious, but there are other people that are also, that maybe you wouldn't think of traditionally in the cooking space that also make sense in that space. It comes down a lot to creative, and it comes down to when you're working with an individual, it's different sometimes than movie or television IP. They're really only going to do one project. So they're looking for a partner, especially on the, like Gordon Ramsay and Glue, where he's doing and launching his own IP and his own title. You're looking for that partner for 3 to 7 years or more. There's not going to be 10 different Gordon Ramsay games out there. There's going to be one game that he's going to go and talk to his audience about and wants to be very actively involved in creative, wants to make sure it fits his brand, that he's passionate about it, equally passionate about it as developers are. So creating really comes down to authenticity and creativity.
Okay. So I'm assuming in the audience we have a number of game developers, and so you guys have, I sense an underlying theme here about qualifying a development team to work on a game, whether or not you're on the outbound or inbound licensing side. So can you guys talk a little bit about how you would qualify a team? What does that mean? What are you looking for from a team? Characteristics of a team that might match a specific IP?
I think it's not necessarily related to IPs. It's more about like what is their track record, what are like successes they had in a specific genre before. So if we are looking for a like a developer who would build a match 3 game, we would probably go to people who are very strong in the match 3 genre first, and find the top players in that specific genre and see if there's any interest in a particular IP. So it's always about finding a partner who has some experience in that genre and not going completely wild. So we wouldn't go to a mid-core studio asking them about building a match 3 game or the other way around.
Right.
So it's about like what have they done? Do they understand why their past games were successful or not? Did they learn from their failures? This is like basically what we are involving like during the diligence phase or whatever you want to call it. We're trying to understand, do they know like what they did right in the game, or was it just a lucky shot? And so we are trying to find the teams that actually have the experience and know exactly what they're doing, and a team that knows how they can translate these features into making a brand engaging game.
Okay. Daniel, you guys have acquired a couple of developers. Can you just talk about how those developers might have approached you guys to work on either Lionsgate games or other licensed IP games?
Yeah, by the way, we haven't acquired any. So Telltale we're invested in, Next Games we're invested in.
That's,
just to clarify that. But
right.
Yeah, I think for us, as I was saying, it really comes down to the team and sort of like the connection that we have with the team and their track record. So it doesn't necessarily have to be that that team has made a bunch of games together under the umbrella that they're currently at, but like you want a seasoned group of veterans, right? So for example, Next Games were a bunch of like ex-Rovio guys, and one of the angel investors was an angel investor in Supercell. So it was a really seasoned team of just very talented developers that we knew were going to make great games. And when they approached AMC about making the Walking Dead game, they knocked it out of the park, explaining how this game was going to not only represent the IP really well, but also grow a great business. And so I think it's, again, comes down to like the team, their vision for making a great game, and then ultimately their passion for the IP. Because as I was saying, the way we think about our business is very long term. We're not interested in making a game for 12 months. We want the game to be around for years, hopefully. And so it is also about that personal connection and making sure that our interests are entirely aligned, and that we're going to strategically sort of be in the weeds together, growing the game.
Right. I think it's worth pointing out, though, that like for us, we don't necessarily just work with the top, what you consider top-tier developers like a Jam City that have a very long track record and are sort of head of their class in specific categories. Like we've worked with developers of all sizes. Right. 5-person shops on up to the Jam Cities and Glues and Zyngas of the world. But for us, like if they can make a great game and they can create a great game as a service and do good live ops and the things that are necessary.
So Mike, how do they get to you guys?
My email address is pretty well known.
Yeah.
Our phone number is listed everywhere. You usually just call and ask for me, and I pick up or call back eventually.
Okay, but yeah, so they're basically, is it developers that have a particular IP in mind, or are they just dialing you up to see what CAA might be working on or into?
The best way that it starts usually is through collaboration, right? The earlier that we get to know a developer, what they're trying to do, where they want to go, not just a month from now, but a year from now and 5 years from now, we can get involved and really be helpful in finding a true partner. Right. Because that's always the goal. You want to find someone that, to the points that were made earlier, like you can't just slap a name on something and then because it's so-and-so, it's going to do really well. It's like, no, it has to be a great game, has to really fit who that person is, has to be that authenticity that we're talking about. So the earlier we get involved, the more, and we can bring our client to be involved, the more likely we think that game's going to be successful. So it usually starts with conversation. And sometimes it comes in with a specific idea, but sometimes it's like, hey, we're working on this game, we really think it might be interesting down the road at some point to be doing something with this type of celebrity in this type of category. What do you think? Okay. And we'll give our thoughts and feedback and things like that.
So Rob, how about you? I mean, how are developers reaching out to you? How are IP owners reaching out to you?
So we don't get a lot of developers reaching out to us, but IP holders do reach out to us all the time. In fact, that's one of the things that I do, and I've inherited email addresses from the previous business development people, and all kind of flows in. One thing I'll say is that no IP that contacts us do I ever dismiss just based on my opinion. So if, Ajax calls me, the soap maker, and they're like, hey, we'd like to do a game, I'm not going to just hit delete. We actually have a procedure internally where I take a look at it, and if I don't know what I'm staring at, I'll literally go next door to our senior VP of games, and I'll say, hey, Johnny, what do you think of this? I don't get it, but you're smarter than I am, tell me. And once we have an idea of some thoughts, we then shoot it out to a broader group, including our COO, Josh Aguado, who likes to be involved, and we actually make a group decision. Right. And we look at it and say, okay, well, it may not work now. We don't know how, what to do with it, but there could be something down the road. And we always get on a phone call. We don't, we're open to everything. Right. That's for inbound. The other way is if somebody within our company, and we have 500 employees, 5 offices, anyone has an idea, if they shoot it over, it'll trickle down to me or people in our group. Mm-hmm. And again, we will give it some thought. And we have, thankfully, because Jam City has been around for a while, we have enough phone numbers and emails that I can email people and say, hey, what do you think of this idea? Okay. So the big thing is to keep an open mind. You never know what IP is going to be interesting or will work.
You guys heard it here first. Ajax Pops is launching in 2018.
There you go.
So when you say someone in the company has an idea, you're talking about someone's identified an IP that they think might be relevant and might be, so
Yeah.
is there examples of those kinds of IPs that have actually made it all the way through the system and you guys have published games yet?
So I'll say that I got to give some credit to our TinyCo office up in San Francisco. They have been working on Family Guy, Quest for Stuff, which is probably the perfect vehicle for putting different IPs in because it's such a pop culture based game. And they've done a great job of identifying everything from, I'm trying to think of, like David Copperfield, and I don't know if they, or in a Magic section,
Right.
and then they'll do Die Hard to individual characters. You know, I believe we're doing He-Man. So it really does go across.
So these are, just to explain, these are in-game integrations of
Absolutely.
third-party IP, which is a very popular trend and actually very important trend, keeps the game fresh, keeps people coming back, engagement, retention are obviously critically important. So those ideas come from anywhere in your company.
From anywhere in the company, and what we try to do is, our games are organized. Each game, even though we have various studios, there's still, there's a responsibility for P&L. And we'll maybe get to that later today, but there's cost considerations. You can't just take an IP and put it in your game. You have to pay for it, and you have to figure out, well, is it going to bring back the investment in time and the development? So what we try to do is to also encourage the team leaders, the executive producers of the game, to think about those things and to say, hey, this year I'd like to have 2 or 3 of these events. Here are the IPs we like. And then ultimately, I also have to give credit, we have a really good consumer insights group that's led by a wonderful woman, Lisa Spano, who they can put IP into focus groups. We can ask our existing players, what do you think of this? And we can really narrow down the IP we want to use, also based on feedback, so that we're not just stabbing in the dark.
Great. So that's a great segue, actually. So let's maybe pivot the conversation to financial considerations. So for inbound licensing, what does a publisher look at to value an IP? What are the characteristics of the IP that lead to a certain threshold as far as the amount a publisher might be willing to spend and amount of a royalty that a publisher might be willing to rev share to acquire the IP? And then on the flip side, with outbound licensing, how does the IP owner value their own IP? How do they know they're getting a good deal? So I'll throw it out there to the group as far as financial considerations.
For us, I think long-term success, similar to what Rob earlier said, is extremely important. So for us, it's like finding a partnership and a long-term partner and someone who understands how to run the game and run live ops and events, making it successful over a long time. That said, there's no, we don't have a framework for a specific deal or even numbers assigned to IPs. It's more about a collaboration process with like different developers and their expectations and developing a business case together. I think it changed quite a bit over the last years. It was quite different maybe 2 or 3 years ago, but nowadays, since we're very quality focused, we are trying to find the best possible game first and the best possible team, and then trying to find a model that will work for the team so they can be successful, but also for us so we would be successful. So it's very custom deals nowadays. I think there are a lot of considerations going into. It's like starting from like, how is the developer going to run live ops? What does it mean? Like, should we contribute on, I don't know, whatever it could be. So it's very, very, custom.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say the exact same thing. Obviously, like we, as a studio, are job to protect the value of our IP, but ultimately, we're forming partnerships to make games, and we spend just as much time with our partners hearing about their business as we do to talk to them about the value of the IP that we have, because we want our interests to be fully aligned, and to your point, live ops are really important, and UA is extremely expensive, and so we need to have deal structures that incentivize our partners to continue to invest in a game and grow that business, and so it's an extremely collaborative process, figuring out where we can add value to the equation, how we can support them from a marketing point of view, and then what deal structure is going to make sense given the realities of their business. So we have over 30 game deals and collaborations on our slate right now, and not one deal is like the same, which our lawyers love, by the way. But it really is like very much a collaborative process. To like once the creative is figured out and we know that we're all excited about the game, the deal part, frankly, is easy because we're all just passionate and figuring out the way to make it work. So
what I'm hearing then is that the amount that a publisher is willing to pay to get into the business with you guys isn't the top consideration.
Not at all.
A little bit different
yeah.
from when I was at Fox. And,
That's why, yeah,
push,
it's very different. It's
yeah.
very different nowadays. But I think for us, creative success is more important than, you know, like upfront investment or upfront MG. So it's more about like long-term success. Obviously, we want to have a commercially successful product, but that needs to be commercially successful for the developer as it is for us. But overall, brand engagement, are we having the right game for the fans? Is that the game they expect? Is that how they want to interact with our franchises? That's more important nowadays than getting it upfront.
Yeah, we're just looking at a much longer time horizon, I think, than people might have been looking 5, 10 years ago in terms of what it means to be successful.
Right.
So you're looking for that partner that's going to be able to drive that business for a long time.
Okay, long tail, yeah. Rob, anything to add there?
I echo what my peers here say. I'll say we have games that the original contract has already expired, and we've extended 3 times.
Yeah.
You know, with our friends at Fox on a particular game, and just because there's success. So we couldn't predict 3 years ago how it was going to do, and if it turns out to be super successful, the way you structure a deal as a partnership incentivizes both sides to keep going.
Right.
If you have a bad deal, if you strike a bad deal and you walk away immediately after the deal's signed, you know, cheering, consider the fact that if it's too much in your favor, come the end of 3 years, you're not going to get that extension. So you want some evenness. That's one thing, not just working at Jam City, but just in 20 plus years of negotiating contracts. You know, you can't always walk out cheering. You have to kind of look at it long term, especially in games, considering it now takes us 18 months to even build a game.
Right.
You know, you're going to be in bed with these folks for a really long time.
Right.
So choose your partners carefully, and if it's a success, it's really fun.
Yeah, we're always looking for the win-win.
Right.
Right, with both people can walk away going, that's a great deal.
Yeah.
Good. So let's maybe pivot to some creative considerations, things that people might not be aware of unless they've been in the licensing business, as far as how building a game based on a licensed IP might impact a development schedule, how you might deal with talent, some of the gotchas. I think we all probably have stories working with talent. I think 3 of us have dealt with Family Guy on the panel, and I have a few very good stories there. By the way, it was one of the best IP I've ever worked on and worked with a great creative team that were really motivated to help and collaborate on games. But so let's get into that. Let's talk about how bringing in an IP might impact development timelines, and then also working with talent. What do you need to consider if you're bringing in talent?
I think the longer the runway, the better. You know, it's not one of those things where it's, oh, I want to do an event next month. Let me go and try to find a celebrity or a talent that I can bring in, and we'll get this locked up in a week, and then like we'll go into production. It takes time.
Right.
You know, these are people, and you know, there's creative considerations and approval processes and things like that. That, you know, it's a collaboration, and there's a back and forth that needs to go into account. So when I was talking earlier, the earlier we get involved, the earlier our clients get involved, like the better it is, because you never want to be under a situation where you're saying, we have to launch by this date or something bad is going to happen.
Right.
You know, we need to know that there's sort of always flexibility, because at the end of the day, it comes down to creating a great game, which we talked about before, and you don't want to have to launch something that you don't feel 100% about.
Okay.
So the more time, the better. So I sort of always, even when you think you're not ready to have the conversation yet, start the conversation.
So as far as getting the financial or the business deal done, and then time to allow the talent to participate through approvals or some form of collaboration, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, definitely. The contract piece is, yes, it takes time, and there's a red line process and back and forth and lawyers and all that stuff, but you can sort of parallel path that sometimes with the creative, and I think, you know, the focus always is really on the creative side, and that takes much longer than the deal points because you want to get that piece right, and once you get that right, to Daniel's point, like, and everyone's excited about what you want to build, what the goal is, you know, the contract sort of just comes into place because everyone really wants to make it work. So it's more, I think, more focused on the actual creative implementation as opposed to necessarily just trying to get the deal terms done.
Do you guys have anything to add? Any maybe stories to share about, you know, things that have worked well, things maybe that haven't worked well?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, we take great pride in being able to get the filmmakers and creative voices behind a franchise involved in the game making process. We think it's to the benefit of the game developers that we're working with to be able to hear from them and get a sense of what the fans have responded to over time. Obviously, Fox and James Davey did an incredible job of that with Family Guy. I think that comes, of course, with a cost because it's one extra layer of conversation that has to happen. So we do our best to sort of plan that into the process when we're looking at the production schedule and being like very open and communicative with our development partner as to what the turnaround time is going to be to get the writer of John Wick to give his feedback.
Right.
And then hopefully, if we're being good partners, there's visibility into what that timeline is going to look like so that the planning can happen on their side. And then for us, we try to be as quick and efficient as possible in that process. We have a joint executive on our games team who's also an executive in the motion picture group and has a direct line of communication into the creative voices behind a given franchise and the executives involved with that franchise. But it is, you know, kind of coming back to everything we've been saying, it's very much a collaborative process, and I think there's definitely been times where it takes an extra few days to get some feedback.
Oh, yeah.
And that's always something that we have to manage, but I think we try to sort of build those contingencies into the production plan so that we don't get into a situation where folks are losing money or, you know, missing dates because of feedback that we're waiting on our side. So.
We have good insight into our clients' production schedules on the other projects they're doing. We know if they're going to be going and shooting a movie in Budapest in three months or whenever, and they're going to be very hard to reach in that time. So
Right.
we know that, we communicate that with the developers so that they know that, so that we're trying to get things, you know, in the windows that we know of availability so they can come and actually be collaborative in that process to give the creative input that's needed to make sure that the game's going to be successful.
Rob?
Man, I could do a 2-hour panel on
Yeah,
all,
I think we all
on
can.
all the
Great stories,
gotchas.
too.
But I think as a publisher, I think I'd also go back to when you're choosing your IP, I would strongly recommend that the hunt for the IP not be more exciting than the actual production of the game. And I've seen this happen before where people have gotten IP, even something as big as Star Wars, and then now they have it, and they absolutely don't know what to do with it because it was just so important to get that IP. And sometimes you lose sight of the fact that if you're working with very, very complex IPs like Star Wars, Harry Potter, Marvel, some of the really big ones, you have to be ready to work with very big entities who have a lot of voices. It's a lot more complicated than working with a particular actor or maybe a TV show where you have, like Family Guy, their production company is great. They're hilarious. They're great writers. They totally get what we're doing. But sometimes when you're working with an IP where it's a little bit more traditional, you really have to put in that extra time, and you have to factor that into your modeling on is that worth it. And going back to approvals, that's the other thing. Make sure that when you're negotiating these agreements, you have enough time to send things off, get it approved, have it come back, and that could be 2 to 3 weeks at a time. It's kind of like communicating with a satellite outside the solar system. You send it out, you got to wait 20 minutes, you know, until the signal comes back, and that's even traveling at the speed of light. So just wanted to, that's kind of like the big heads up. Sometimes you get so excited for the hunt to get the IP, but I think you really have to imagine what it's going to be like to work with that IP, and you better have systems in place to actually deal with that.
Yep. And my advice would also be, like, on top of that, we also involve, like, the movie makers, you know, the TV show creators in the production process. They're usually in touch with the developers, and they get really upset if a developer doesn't understand the vision of an IP. Right. So my advice is, like, not only, like, watch the movie, but also try to understand, like, what the movie maker was trying to create. What is their vision? How do they want to build the alien universe? What did they have in mind for, like, the whole storyline? how did they come to this, and things like that. And we've seen like games being not as successful just because of like they couldn't grasp like the core of the IP. They couldn't understand what this is about. And if you talk, for example, with like the Futurama production team, Rough Draft, they've been working on that show like for now 25 years, and they had a very strong vision for Futurama, and it's all about like in the early development process understanding that vision so you can execute like new storylines and that are in line with the overall brand. And I think that's very important, just trying to understand what did they have in mind by building this. Not going in like if you want to do a Futurama game, it's not about being like Bender is drunk all the time, right? That's not the core of the IP. And I think it's very important in the beginning, early, talk to the movie makers, to the production teams on our side, for example, and try to understand what is actually their vision about this.
Right, that's a very good point, and I think what Rob, you're saying about the hunt is not as important ultimately as the process of making the game. I can tell you from my own personal experience, in one instance, we had a game developer who wanted to understand everything about the IP. They wanted to understand who was responsible for writing, who was responsible for creating, voice talent. And so we arranged for this developer to come and attend table reads for about a month. And we sat in the background. If you've ever been into a table read, there's the production group, and then along the outside perimeter, there's seats there. And we sat there for a month. And finally, at one point, the executive producer of the show said, "Who are you guys, and what are you doing?" And so we explained what we were doing, and we introduced the developer into the process. And the creative team was so appreciative that the developer took the time, took the effort. He actually traveled to do this, that it created a very, as seamless as you can get process through development. So
we've done a lot with developers where they've brought the entire production team to a concert, and they've been there very early, and they're backstage, and they're seeing, what goes into the production of that event, and who's involved and things like that, because they want to give an authentic experience to the players of the game who are going to be seeing this in a different light, but they've never seen it themselves, so it's helpful to give a light to that, or bring them to taping of a show, or whatever it is that they need to really capture that authenticity. And we'll bring the artist down, and we'll bring this, and they're sketching while it's going on, and they're putting it together, and you see it in the final product. Yep. You see it when you see it happen, you go, I know exactly where this scene came from. I know exactly why we did this storyline. Like, these things are all coming and pulling from the real world. And the fans can feel that too. Yeah, in a very real
nowadays,
way.
You can't avoid. You got to be credible. Yeah, for sure.
The other thing too is as we're making our games, I'm sure you guys experience this as well. There's always decision points where it's like, am I going to stay super loyal to the IP, or am I going to make a sacrifice to what might be a core tenet of the IP to make the game awesome? And we try to lean on the side of making the game awesome because we're adapting into a gaming environment. Right. But the more time that we spend with the filmmakers and voices behind that franchise, and the more time that our developers spend with those folks, it's easier for them to for the developer to make those decisions, because they know that if they're doing something different than the IP's done before, but it's to service the game, they're doing it in a way that the fans are going to appreciate and genuinely enjoy the sort of new experience that they have, rather than feeling like something's been tarnished for that IP.
Right.
How is it best to approach an IP owner? In terms of reaching out to you, I think there's, a lot of companies here that are small startups, or at least, have done one game, and maybe a little holding themselves back, So how would they best approach you, just overall? If anybody wants to kind of take that.
I would say for us, I feel like a big part of my job is just meeting as many talented people as possible. So if there's an opportunity for us to meet, whether it's reaching out over email or an event like this, I'm always super excited to have that conversation. So
it's the same for us. I think we're attending basically all games events around the world. We have BD people at every single event. Try to reach out to them whenever they're in the pitch and match system, just ping them up.
So don't be shy, right? Reach out, and you guys want to work with them, and you want to look at every piece of content. Anybody have any questions? Q&A. Okay, I will ask a question. I will gladly ask one, because I think the fundamental, obviously, reason why we're here is because of licensing. But why should somebody invest in a license versus taking their own IP, and what are the advantages of licensing overall?
I think what we're looking for is, what everyone's looking for is we want to help drive down the cost of user acquisition, drive up the LTV, drive up engagement, and talent and TV and film and things like that, they have engaged audiences already that can help solve these problems. To Rob's point, you can't rely on that IP or that individual to solely be the thing that you're standing on. It needs to be a great game. You need to have the right systems in place to do your own marketing, to do your own user acquisition, and this should be looking at adding fuel to the fire, but the fire already has to exist. But to us, it is jet fuel, right? It can take you from A to B much quicker than maybe you could do independently.
That makes sense.
Yeah, for us, we obviously understand, as we're creating a game together, it's a real partnership, and so we as a studio look for opportunities to add as much value as possible. And I would say, one of the things that we're really proud of at Lionsgate is just sort of the entrepreneurial spirit internally, and the fact that we collaborate across divisions really well. So when we're releasing a game with a partner, we don't just have the games team supporting that game, we have the full weight of Lionsgate's marketing engine behind it. And that can be extremely meaningful. We had a Lionsgate Games booth at New York Comic Con and Comic Con last year. We had activations with the cast. It was for our Power Rangers game. We also did that for Next Games and their Walking Dead game. We do a lot of heavy lifting on social marketing and reaching out to fans and fan communities that are passionate about our IP. So we definitely feel a great sense of obligation to make sure that we're servicing our partners as much as possible and bringing them as much value to the table with the IP that we have and the audiences that we've built. And ultimately, we hope that reduces UA costs quite substantially and allows you to get to consumers in a really direct way.
Yeah, and I think it's not only UA, it's also what you mentioned before, lifetime value. We see, that long-term retention, a brand definitely helps you in increasing your long-term retention because of the loyal fan base that is already out there that likes a movie or the franchise. And we definitely see that this translates into a higher long-term retention, which then drives lifetime value.
So let's talk about new IP. At what point would you say, each of you individually, would think that a new IP is validated, so to say, that it's a good enough game that you would have faith in the IP itself?
So are you talking about, when you say new IP, are you talking about, say, at what point does a television show, cross a point where it might be worthwhile from a publisher's perspective, something like that?
Yeah, or a game,
Yeah,
or
okay.
just anything that's
I think so. When I was doing the inbound licensing for a TV property in particular, you've got to make sure you've got a property that's going to be on air, have an audience, exposed to your potential group of customers. So shows that are in their first year or second year aren't necessarily great candidates for that, because by the time the game comes out, the show might not be on the air. So there's a bunch of examples of that. We've all been through that. So shows like Family Guy, for instance, The Simpsons, for instance. I did a great product based on the television show Glee, because we knew that the show was getting a 2-year pickup. We went to Konami. They had a karaoke game, and we integrated and sold a ton. It was a perfect integration, and Konami was confident that the show was going to be on the air and was going to be around. So that's a great example. I picked up the Ultimate Fighting Championship right as it was sort of coming on and peaking in its sort of current iteration. So they had just done the Ultimate Fighter TV show, so they exposed MMA to a bigger audience, and it was growing, and we saw that. And when I was at THQ, I actually was on both sides of the UFC stuff. When I was at Endeavor, I went out with the UFC team to look at potential partners, evaluating whether or not it was the right time to get back into the business. I think we were pretty confident that the business was going to grow. This was about 2006, 2007, or actually a little bit before that. And the business was just scaling and taking off. And then I went to THQ and acquired the license. And the reason why THQ was a great candidate, we had the WWE games. We were very successful. We were very experienced in the game mechanics, and it translated to some successful games. So It's about, where a property is in its life cycle, where it's building, and then how long is the property going to be out there. You guys have anything else?
Yeah, I think there's something else too. You have to look at your own goal. Basically, there are properties out there right now, IP that we've looked at, that have super solid, rabid fan bases. However, they are not large enough to fulfill a goal for Jam City as a publisher. Right. We are now at a size and scale where if a game makes it into the top 200, that's not going to cut it for us. So sometimes there could be great IP out there that we love and we would make a terrific game, but once we look at the overall investment of the time and effort, and basically like a studio to some extent, if it's taking up a slot of our resources, we really want to see that IP also has the longevity and the scope globally to bring a return on the investment. So if you're a smaller studio, you may go pick that rabid small fan base because what you get out of it is exposure, experience. You probably can make it work financially for yourselves, and you build the track record so that when you're talking to larger IP holders down the road, they'll say, oh, I like what you did with X or Y.
Hi. How do you guys approach like matching genres to particular IPs? For particular games, et cetera. And at what point do you assess whether an IP is kind of saturated either in the mobile or console game space and probably needs some space or time before kind of delving back into a specific genre or games in general?
We definitely are very careful about having multiple SKUs of an IP in the marketplace. It's hard enough to rise above the noise, let alone to have two games competing with each other. So we definitely, just as a philosophical approach to our business, would never have two games that compete with one another. In terms of mapping on genres, I think ultimately it's sort of thinking through like the core tenets of the IP and what the audience that loves that IP is expecting. So with John Wick, for example, we made a first-person shooter VR game. Who doesn't want to be John Wick and get in there? And if you're a fan of John Wick, that's super fun to do. As I was saying with Power Rangers, the notion of being a superhero with your friends is sort of very core to Power Rangers, and fighting is very core to Power Rangers. So being able to have a PvP fighting game was very contextual to that IP. We just announced that we're doing a story-driven Divergent game, kind of an interactive story built into What's Your Story, which is a new game that Ludia is launching. And that was also very contextual. It's a young adult series. The audience that Ludia is targeting for What's Your Story and their competitors like Episode target a young adult audience. So, and the notion of being able to sort of extend a book series like Divergent into an interactive story felt very contextual to the IP. So it's really just a matter of sort of looking at, as we were saying before, obviously the quality of the game, but making sure that the game and the game mechanics feel very contextual to the audience that we're targeting, and also the expectations of what that audience would have for the extension of that IP.
On our side, we on top of that, we also have an insights group that looks at the value of IPs from a gaming perspective. So our insight groups would actually take IPs and then talk to PC console gamers of like, what kind of game would you like to play for Die Hard, or Bob's Burgers, or Family Guy? So we've did like lots of research around our IPs, and we would usually during like the process of finding a developer also share all the insights and everything we've got in terms of data to show like this is like the kind of game an audience would like to see. We also try to evaluate, should it be a PC console or should it be a mobile title? So it's like part of the process, trying to match like the right genre to the right IP.
Same. We use a lot of data and analytics when we look at the audience demographics of our clients and what might be the general audience demographics of a specific game mechanic or genre or things like that. Once we feel good about the creative and the authenticity piece, you also want to make sure that there's that overlap though, that their audience wants to play a casual match 3 game or a mid-core shooter game or whatever it is, because even if you feel like you have that authenticity but you don't have necessarily the right audience overlap, it might still not be a good idea to go and make that game. You really want to hit both pieces.
Great. Well, thank you for participating.